decided on the Indiana Jones type fit. We're gonna go look at the San Antonio Museum of Art. Um, Kind of quite fitting museum grave robbing. So let's go.
Come on. Come on, baby. I guess it means the power's off.
Was planning on looking at some photographs, but I talked to the staff there, and apparently the photographs that they have aren't on display. So instead, I went up the stairs and went to their Latin America collection. And I was drawn to this piece right here. The altar is what drew my eye in the first place. This large gilded wooden altar is what drew my gaze, even if I didn't know what the painting in the center of it was depicting. It's in the center of the room, so it automatically catches my eye. As soon as I walk in, I see it, and I'm like, I want to know what this is, but I decide to take my turn about the room to see anything else that catches my eye. And there were a couple things, but there was nothing as striking. So then when I get to the back of the room and I'm starting to see the large altar and the painting more up close, is when I was like, yeah, this is what my project is going to be about. And then I see this guy. I look to my right and I see this guy there, and he's sort of standing there, and we're both taking in the altar at the same time, just on different sides of it. I'm on the left, he's on the right. And I go and sit down on the bench they have there right in front of it, and I'm looking at it, and he's just kind of lingering there. And so I decide to turn over my shoulder and I ask him, "What do you think of it?" Because I get the feeling we're on the same wavelength, and little did I know we were. So he sits down and we start talking about it. We get to talking a little bit about ourselves, but then when we get to the painting, it becomes clear we're both more focused on the altar than we are focused on the painting itself. And I think it's because I Hayram, the guy that I was speaking to, he's a med student. He admitted to not knowing that much about art, and to be fair, neither do I as a poli sci major, beyond the realm of like the philosophers we've studied. So I don't think we're as focused on the technicalities or the contrast or the lighting or the skill that goes into the painting, but both of us are more focused on the altar. And I think we both understand the work it took to go into carving the altar as far as woodworking goes. It's because it's easier to imagine the tools and the manual labor associated with woodworking to create the intricate rivets and flowers and leaves that are in the actual altar. And there are a lot more like tools used in woodworking, so I think in that way it's easier to, even if we don't know what those tools are, it's easy to have that mental image of like a variety of tools needed to create and to structure the wood. But I think it's a lot harder to imagine the structure of what goes into a painting, because neither of us really know. We're not painters ourselves. We're not artists ourselves, and that isn't to say painting is not skilled or it's not as intensive as woodworking. That's not it at all. It is just easier to understand how woodworking is challenging, and it's not, we just don't have that same understanding of painting. And that's where I think we both connected on is that piece of the conversation. And because painters, why it's hard to imagine painting and the task itself in my head as in comparison to woodworking is I can imagine the tools a craftsperson would use to make um would use to carve wood, but I can't really imagine anything else in my head for a painter other than made like the different colors of paint and a canvas and a couple brushes maybe. So for me, it's a lot harder to understand that process just because I don't really understand what all goes into it. But I can see and I can visualize the woodworking a lot easier. And for that, we were both drawn to the altar. I think the most memorable part of experiencing the art was the human connection. I was drawn to the altar and the painting itself, but I it doesn't compare to the maybe just 10-minute conversation I had with him. Experiencing the art by myself for the project is one thing, but having someone else there, it means a lot more, not just for this project, but for me. And it meant more than I could say. There are two different elements of this piece of art. I talked a little bit about the altar frame earlier. It's called the Maria altar screen. It was made in the 18th century in Bolivia. It's called a retablo, and it was originally created in the Renaissance and then was introduced to the Americas by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The retablo had these inscriptions on it. There was this one closer to the base, which is the one you see in the center. And then there were these two other inscriptions, one at the top left and one towards the top right. They look to be depicting letters that are sort of intertwined together to create some sort of symbolism. I tried to look up to see what they could mean, and the only thing that I could really come up with was something called a Christogram, which is supposed to be a symbol depicting Jesus Christ's like name. However, none of these look like anything of what a Christogram would look like, which I'll put on the screen. So these may be I don't know what these would be actually. They're just they seem to be symbols of a name perhaps. Whose name? I don't know, but the symbolisms there, I thought they were a pretty interesting mystery. And then the second part in the middle there, you see a painting. And the painting is called Annunciation, which was believed to be made in the late 17th to the early 18th century. It was also made in Bolivia. And it's depicting the scene of the Gospel of St. Luke. And it's about the Archangel Gabriel telling the Virgin Mary that she's going to have Jesus. And the Holy Spirit is symbolized by the dove shining above with its heavenly light. Mary is like sat there, sort of reaching for Gabriel with one hand, and her other hand remains on the Bible. And Gabriel is holding these lilies in one hand, symbolizing Mary's purity. The altar frame and the painting they're nearly perfect symbols as to why the Spaniards came to America in the first place. Beyond trading routes, mainly they came for God and gold. So we see God in the literal painting there, and we see the gold mainly in the altar frame. So why they wanted to come to America for God is because in Europe they had the 30 Years' War between the Protestants and the Catholics after that schism that they had. And so a lot less people in Europe were actually part of the Catholic Church. It was a lot more normalized, especially in certain countries, to be more Protestant rather than Catholic. And so you see that split. And so the Spaniards come and they want to convert a lot of the Native American people to Catholicism. And the second part of it is gold. The Spanish were one of the wealthiest countries at the time in Europe. With the Portuguese, they pioneered something called trade post empire. They started creating these trade posts along the coast of Africa as they went towards the Indian Ocean, which is how they got a lot of their wealth. And so they were obsessed with finding this legend of a city of gold or something, the legend of El Dorado. If you don't know, there's a Disney movie based on it. It's called The Road to El Dorado, and it's basically just a city of gold. They were obsessed with that, and you can see it in their religious iconography, like here in the altarpiece. And when I think of how gaudy and how glamorous and how glitzy and how
Feel like a femme queen. Feel like a femme queen. Feel like my paint, my makeup. Feel like a femme queen. Feel like the cunt tea. Feel so pussy. Feel like a femme queen. You'll never feel like me.
I've been watching The Crown recently, and a lot of what monarchy is it's to and a lot of in the first season and the second season especially, you hear a lot of the conservative and the older members of the royal family especially talking about like monarchy is to give something for people to aspire to. And I feel like the idea of a monarchy because the whole idea of a monarchy is for it to be God ordained. So I feel like the similar idea of how the monarchy is something to aspire to is similar to like the older, more outward displays of wealth that the Catholic Church engaged in. Um, just as displays of power and to give something for people to aspire to, or so it is said anyway. In Walter Benjamin's the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction in section 3, he says we define aura of the latter as the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be. If, while resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains, of that branch. And aura is a unique presence, authority, and a sense of distance from something. In this case, we're talking about art. And he later goes on to explain there are 4 different components of aura. There is authenticity, whether that a piece of art is real and if it's the original thing and not a copy or a rendition of something. It's history. And so by history, it can mean like what paint is available at the time, what art style is most popular at the time, who is painting it, what culture does it from, that sort of thing. And then there's value in the ritual and cult value, which art that is created for ritualistic or religious purposes. There is an aura left over from that like sacred function. And then there is a uniqueness and a presence. And the uniqueness and the presence from the art comes from you experiencing it in person at that specific location. And I think what most relates to this piece in particular is the cult value because originally the altar frame and the painting were made for converting Native Americans into Catholicism. And so it is made in for the purpose of teaching and to teach part of the stories and the cultural traditions of what is in Catholicism. And then there's also what I got from it personally was the uniqueness and the presence of it. Is I would never have met Harem if I did not go in person to see this piece of art, even if I looked at it online, I wouldn't have been able to get that physical sense of sitting with it and just seeing all the finer nuances you might not get from a photo. And I think that was definitely the most memorable part of my trip there was just having that 10-minute conversation with Hayrim. So I think for me in this experience, the uniqueness and the presence definitely outweighed any other part of the aura that I personally experienced when seeing the altar frame and the painting. In Kant's Critique of Judgment in section 46, he says, "Genius is the talent that gives rule to art. Since talent as an innate productive faculty of the artist belongs itself to nature, we may put it this way: genius is the innate mental predisposition through which nature gives the rule to art." And he goes on to explain what constitutes somebody as having genius. And so there's four different criteria for something to be considered like a work of genius. And the work must be original, A. So it cannot be just like a variation or very heavily inspired by something. It must be something original. The second thing is the piece must serve to be an exemplary model that um, others base their work on. So it needs to change an era. It needs to start a movement in art. It needs to be popular. And the third thing is there can be no conscious explanation for how the artist created a piece. It is something natural, and if you can explain it, then it isn't natural. It's something that just can be taught, so it needs to be unexplainable. And a work of genius, according to Kant, can only be from fine art. He makes an example of how Isaac Newton is a genius because he discovered gravity and he's very good at math and a scientist and all these things, and he's brilliant himself. However, his work isn't a work of genius. To be a work of genius, it must be art. And so this interested me in particular because I don't think, according to Kant's rigorous list, I don't think a lot of religious art could be considered works of genius. And why that is because a lot of religious art, A, is not original, and a lot of religious art is, especially when we're talking about Christianity. A lot of Christian art, specifically when we're talking about paintings, it is not original and it's based upon stories from the Bible. And these stories are already detailed, so they're not expounding upon anything. And these paintings are mainly used to serve as ways. Originally, a lot of artwork for Christianity was meant to communicate and inspire devotion, conformity, because people were not literate back in the day. Being literate was something only the wealthy could really afford because they could afford tutors. And so that's what these religious artworks were based on. And they were meant to tell a story from the Bible. They weren't meant to make anything really original. And the second thing is it's not I and the second thing is a lot of religious art is, like I said, it's done for conformity purposes. So there's nothing too exemplary about any like usual religious pieces that define an era or that create a new style of art. But there are exceptions to the rule, definitely. Um, when we're talking about the art piece here, whether it be the retablo or we're talking about the actual painting of Mary and Gabriel telling her that she's going to have Jesus, it wouldn't be considered a work of genius by Kant himself under these conditions. However, I do think there are exceptions to the rule of what religious art can be considered a work of genius, and I think a good example of that would be Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. because he's more, instead of just depicting a story from the Bible, he's depicting more of a scene. And the last judgment in the Bible is described. However, there's no specific. It basically is just described as Jesus um, coming down to earth and basically saving the Christians above and bringing them into heaven. That's all it is, but it isn't necessarily. It's not concrete in how exactly that's done. And so Michelangelo gives it new breath and a new look or depiction of how exactly the Last Judgment would look when it's happening. So that's why I feel like Michelangelo's piece would be considered would be considered a work of genius according to Kant's philosophy here and his theory of genius. Something interesting that we talked about in class that I really liked was how like the categories of art was invented during the 18th century. It was mentioned that there was a separation between art and from like craft. I thought that distinction would have been made earlier than like the 1700s, but you know, that was pretty interesting to me.
I'm bringing sexy back. Yeah. The mother